Years ago, I used to feed my bees nothing but high fructose corn syrup. It seemed to suit my needs at that time. It was inexpensive, it was convenient. I wasn't trying to do anything fancy. I wasn't drawing out boxes of foundation and building colonies from scratch on sugar syrup. I was just trying to simply get my bees heavy for winter. And I seemed to have pretty good luck with that high fructose corn syrup for that purpose. I was purchasing high fructose corn syrup 55 or HFCS 55. You can also purchase 42. And the 42 is less expensive, but it has a tendency to crystallize much easier than the 55. So for that reason, I kind of never really used that much. I would go in with a couple friends back in those days. We would order a tanker load, and we would meet in one of our parking lots of one of our honey houses, and we would have the tanker fill up an array of 55-gallon drums for us. If I remember correctly, it took 82 or 84 drums to hold a full tanker load. And I went on like that for quite a while. It worked good. I would put a 55-gallon drum of syrup on my truck bed and pull it over with a hand truck and fill up 5-gallon jugs and carry them into the bee yard and fill division board feeders. They were the old black plastic type. I would put quarter-inch hardware cloth folded up like an accordion in the feeders, and that would give the bees kind of a ladder to walk in and out of the feeder with, and that kept drowning bees to a minimum. It worked okay. And then eventually I got to the point where I was buying tanker loads by myself, and around that time I purchased a gasoline-driven gear pump from Daydant. It came with a 100-foot hose, and it worked pretty good. I was happy with that. But one thing I figured out is that if I added just 5 or maybe 10 gallons of water to the drum of syrup, it would pump a lot easier. I had a lot better luck with it. Well, that first season that I did that, I kind of accidentally ran across something that caught my attention. Before I'd been using the pump and thinning out the syrup with water, every spring I would see that the leftover syrup was slightly crystallized in the comb. And the season I started thinning out the syrup, the next spring I found that the syrup left over was not crystallized. And that's about the time I started to figure out that there might be just a little more to the chemistry of feeding bees than meets the eye. Not long after that, I started trying to build colonies on sugar syrup. And a friend of mine, Jerry Latner, who used to run the Daydant Center down there in Florida, and who is also the man I buy my sugar syrup from, he's sort of a sugar syrup broker these days, he told me that I'd have a lot better luck on sucrose syrup, so I started buying tanker loads of sucrose syrup. That comes in with about 67% solids, which is about 2 to 1. And he was right. It works a lot better than high fructose corn syrup. I would thin it out some, turn it into 1 to 1, and at that first year, I actually had some high fructose corn syrup left over, and I used it plus sucrose in different yards trying to build out full deeps of foundation and get the bees into a double deep after the sourwood flow and get them ready for winter. And it was very apparent to me that the sucrose syrup was doing a much better job. The bees were maintaining more brood, and they were drawing out foundation much quicker and much better than they were on the high fructose corn syrup. Now, the high fructose corn syrup had an effect that some people like about it, and that is that it got the colonies plenty heavy. I could draw foundation out on it, even though not as quickly as the sucrose, and then the bees would just pack the box full of syrup. So the result was that I had less brood in the colonies that I built out with high fructose corn syrup, and I had a lot more weight. So that can be used to your advantage if that's all you're trying to do is get your bees heavy for winter. But I noticed the next spring it was very evident to me that the bees that had been built out on sucrose had more bees in the spring. It was very noticeable that the bees that had overwintered on high fructose corn syrup just simply didn't have as many bee bodies as the ones on sucrose. And that's really when I began to figure this whole thing out. Now, I have a lot of friends, well, several friends, I should say, that these days are purchasing tanker loads of half and half. In other words, it's half sucrose and half high fructose corn syrup, and they report that they're having pretty good luck with that. So I think that's actually what Man Lake sells as their Pro Suite. I think it's pretty much the same thing, just 50-50 sucrose and high fructose corn syrup. Beekeepers are reporting pretty good luck with that. I'm still probably going to say that if you had straight sucrose, you would do better in the building bees and the drying out foundation department. But if you're just trying to put weight on your colonies, that 50-50 is probably a pretty good choice. These days, we mix our own syrup with granulated cane sugar that we buy by the semi-load. It comes on pallets. I think we usually get about 44,000 pounds on a load. And what I've found is that it's a lot easier for us to mix sugar syrup as we need it. That way we don't have to worry about fermentation, and we can mix it exactly at the thickness we want. There are times when we want 2-to-1. There's times when we want 1-to-1. There's even occasions we want a little thinner than that for just strictly drawing out foundation. So that's the reason I don't buy tanker loads of sucrose syrup, because I don't want to have to worry about storing it and worrying about it fermenting. Obviously, the thinner the syrup is, the quicker it ferments. 2-to-1 doesn't ferment badly, but it will ferment eventually, and that's something you have to consider if you're purchasing sucrose syrup already mixed in a tanker load. Another reason I like mixing my own sugar syrup is I learned a long time ago that the quality of syrup goes down with time, especially in the heat of summer, and that's both high fructose corn syrup and sucrose syrup. It's not a big deal in the summer when the bees are replenishing their numbers continuously, but if you're going to overwinter bees on sugar syrup, whether it's high fructose corn syrup or sucrose, you need to understand that old syrup isn't that great. I watched a webinar that was put on by a fellow by the name of Rob Curry not too long ago. He's up in Manitoba, and he's got a lot of research on sugar syrup. It's worth watching if you're interested in this subject. I'll put a link in my video description to it. It's actually on Ian Stepler's YouTube channel. He's got it recorded, and he's got it there. And if you're interested in the quality of sugar syrup for overwintering, I would recommend checking that out. We are completely done feeding for the winter. I just threw this stuff up on the truck bed so I could show the type of equipment we use. Of course, as you see in some of our videos, we use a lot of these 5-pound honey jars. A lot of them get carried around in an old deep super box that was perhaps rotten on a corner, and we'd saw it down and make it the same height as the jars. And then if we end up going to a place where we need a lot of jars, we might choose to take one of these totes full of jars. Usually we just hand load these boxes. Used to be you could buy a half-a-gallon mason jar with a 70 millimeter, or what they would call a 70G lid, but I've not been able to find them lately, so we've just gone to all 5-pound honey jars. They're really expensive, but they're kind of the best choice. We usually don't put bunches of holes in these lids. We have a stick here this is actually a frame nail. Miraculously, we've had this particular stick for a very long time. It's just a frame nail through a 3/4 by 3/4 inch stick with a little extra wood on top, so we can pound it with our palm, and we'll just put one hole if it's a very small colony, or maybe 2, 3 holes is a good choice for many nukes. If you're trying to draw foundation in a nuke, usually 4 holes is a good choice. But that's right there. That's our choice for feeding small nukes. We utilize both 1-gallon and 2-gallon buckets. It just depends on the job we're trying to do and the circumstances. And there's a lot of variables involved in feeding. For instance, if we're just feeding a 5-frame nuke that we've just started, we might choose to use a 1-gallon bucket. One of our favorite ways for starting nukes in the spring that we sell is to give them 2 frames of brood and a frame of food, drawn comb with honey and pollen, and 2 frames of foundation, and then feed them out until they're ready to sell. And a 1-gallon bucket just about accomplishes that perfectly. And we like to use 1-to-1 syrup for that purpose in the spring. We might also use a 1-gallon bucket in the summer on a smaller colony that we're trying to grow. You save the 2-gallon buckets for larger colonies that can take it down in a timely manner. I don't like to put a large bucket of syrup on a colony in warm weather and have them take a long time to take it down, because you can have fermenting going on in the bucket. I'd much rather use a small bucket and feed them more often and have less fermentation than use a bigger one and have it ferment halfway through the process. Now, I have seen lots of fellas using larger buckets like 2.5-gallon and 3-gallon, and those are great on a good strong colony. They can be problematic on a small colony because the larger the bucket, this is what I've noticed, the larger the bucket, the more dribble or drip you have. The small buckets have a lot less drip, so I wouldn't put a large bucket on a small colony for that reason. As I said earlier, we'll drill the right amount of holes in the plug for the job. Sometimes we might only want 3 or 4 holes in the plug, and there might be other times when we want 10 or 12 when we're trying to draw foundation out on a big colony. You really can't buy these buckets with this particular plug in it. This plug is called, if you look it up or you Google it, it's called a 2-inch tint plug. And I'm going to put information in the description of the video where you can get this plug in quantity. They come in cases of 2,175, and for people that don't want to buy that kind of quantity, we do have small bags of 25 or 50 in our store, and I'll put the phone number for our store in the video description also, in case you want to just order a few instead of that big case. They're really inexpensive when you order that big case of over 2,000. I forget the exact price, but it's not much. Okay, Seth is putting holes in some new lids. He's putting about 10 holes in. That's a good number for our purposes at this time of year. We use a 1/16 inch drill bit. We use a good sharp bit. It has to be sharp to remove the plastic, not just poke a hole through, but cut a hole through. And the reason he reams it once or twice after he cuts it is to remove all the, I guess you'd call it, the little debris of plastic that hangs on. You want a good clean hole. If you just push a hole through with a nail or a dull bit, the fragments of plastic left over can close back and kind of close the hole. John's cleaning lids over here. It's kind of a tedious process, but it's not too bad. He just takes a little frame nail on a stick and just pokes the hole clean. And we keep a nice array of lids with us when we're working in the bee yard. I wanted to add that you can buy plastic plugs with stainless steel embedded in them for using with these feeder buckets. I believe Better Bee in New York sells them. I'm sure there's a few other outfits around the country that sell them too. I'll try to find a picture and embed in this video, and maybe even a link in the video description of where you can purchase them. A long time ago, I used to use buckets that had stainless steel screen embedded on the underside of the lid. Just took a hot pipe and embedded it, kind of branded it into the plastic, and it worked pretty good. If I remember correctly, it was 40 mesh per square inch. I think that's the proper mesh size for feeding. At that time, I didn't have these extra plugs in the bucket, and I was taking the lids on and off every time to fill the buckets. And it wasn't very long before I started to have a lot of seepage and leaking around the gaskets when the buckets were inverted. So even if you're going to embed stainless steel in your lid, I still recommend using a plastic plug for filling the bucket. If you're going to wash them, just get a nozzle and just turn the bucket upside down and, blast it out with hot water instead of taking the lid off to clean it. You'll get a lot more life out of these buckets. Oddly enough, these plastic plugs don't fatigue very quickly. It's very rare that we have to throw one out. Even the little pull tab on the little finger pull tab doesn't seem to break off very often. So David is drilling some of these holes in the lids for our little plug. Pretty simple. Could you turn that off a minute? We get a good look at this drill bit. It's an adjustable bit. And David tells me it's really close to 1 15/16. I'm sure he's tweaked it a little bit. It's really important to get that hole just right. That's why it's good to use this adjustable thing so you can tweak it a few thousandths of an inch one way or another. It doesn't take long to drill the holes. Okay.
You do have to be very gentle as it's ready to break through, or you'll leave a lip or a nick up in the hole, and you don't want that.
This is our custom carbide bit hole saw that we had made. It's an odd size. This 70 millimeter cap that goes on a standard quart jar is not exactly 2 3/4. It's just a little bit bigger. I have a friend who uses a 2 3/4 hole saw. He swelled it out a little bit and he said it works fine. We just went ahead and had the money spent on these this carbide tip one. It was expensive, but it was worth it if you're going to do a lot of these. Okay, go ahead, give us a demonstration on this thing.
We have discovered we have to blow air on the bit to keep it from getting clogged up. It'll clog up like halfway through. So if you blow air on it, it just improves the process quite a bit.
Okay. Okay. Then you got a nice 70 millimeter hole there. If you try to do this with a hand drill or a small or weak drill press, it'll just tear things to pieces. You could hurt yourself, actually. Best to have a good stout drill press like the one we have here for doing these big holes. I really try to avoid feeding with buckets in the wintertime. If I have to, I like to use one of these 70G canning jar lids. It's a standard ring that goes on any mason jar. It has a little lip along the top, and when you put it in the hole, any rainwater that might run underneath the bucket will hit that lip and run around and go out the other side. In the summer I don't use them because in warm weather a drip or two is just no big deal. But in the wintertime when it's cold, even a little bit of moisture dripping down on the cluster can cause trouble. So again, when I use buckets in the wintertime, I like to put those rings on. Well, at this point, I would guess that anybody that's watched many of my videos has come to the conclusion that I'm a big proponent of feeding bees, and I am. But I think I probably need to make something crystal clear, and that is that I don't think there's anything that can beat Mother Nature when it comes to building good, strong, healthy colonies in the spring and summer. Sugar syrup is not as good as a fresh nectar flow. And I don't think there's a pollen substitute on the planet that can replace a variety of incoming fresh quality pollen. But that having been said, I think that sugar syrup and pollen substitute can be used as a tool to build colonies when we're in a dearth or under certain circumstances. I also think that sugar syrup can be used as a substitute for honey in some overwintering situations. If you go back to my video, Feeding Bees Part 1, you can see me talk about that some. I hope these two, Part 1 and Part 2 videos on feeding bees are helpful. I would keep in mind that this is all just my opinion, and I've always told new beekeepers that the most successful beekeepers I know don't always go by one person's opinion, that it's up to you to go out there and find all the information you can and get smart and come to your own conclusion. Everybody does something different. Everybody has their own ideas, and that's one of the beauties of beekeeping. That's part of the art of beekeeping. And feeding bees definitely falls into that department. Everybody has different ideas on how to do it, what to feed, when to feed, and for what reasons to feed. And I hope that my ideas have been helpful.